Right, so my name's Stephanie, and although I was born in Canada, right, I think I've got a wee bit of a Scottish accent.
So as you can see, there are two of us today. We're joined by Louise, not Brian, who's going to be our guest interviewee or co-host today on Church Chat. And we're joined by renowned international pro-life speaker, Stephanie Gray, who's come all the way from Vancouver. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you, it's great to be here.
So Stephanie, why are you here? Why are you here in lovely Scotland?
Well, I'm excited to be here. I always like to say, because my dad is from here, so it's super fun to come to my fatherland. But I am here to speak this evening, actually, at Strathclyde University on the topic of assisted suicide. And then this weekend, and then this weekend for the SPUC Youth Conference in England. And I'm super excited to speak on the topic of abortion to the youth over there.
Amazing.
Yeah, so obviously it's a very dark time just now in the UK and Ireland regarding pro-life. Your role, how do you see your role? Do you see it as preventing more slides in these legislations or reversing the slide?
Certainly we need to reverse or prevent in the few places left in the world where you don't yet have access to abortion or also assisted suicide. My key focus is to influence the influencers and very much to be a formator and an educator, helping people understand the reasons behind the pro-life claims. And with the idea that if we can change public opinion and have people well-formed to reject abortion and assisted suicide, then that will eventually lead to a shift in public policy to embrace a pro-life worldview, or a maintenance of a pro-life worldview from a political perspective where in a few places there still is a pro-life law in place.
There is a push in America and beyond for infanticide, and to define infanticide as late-term abortions, even postpartum, post-birth abortions. How would you even advise us to try and fight against that culture? Because it's happened, it's passing, people are not seeing the evident reality that these are children who are born separate from their parents, yet they're still continuing to be murdered effectively.
Right. I think what we need to do is tap into beliefs the culture does already embrace and show how those beliefs actually align more with the pro-life perspective. So for example, to ask the average individual anywhere in the world, really, be it America over here, or not, is to say, do you believe in human rights? And if yes, well, who gets human rights? Isn't it humans? If I believe in children's rights, well, then that means children get the rights. If I believe in women's rights, that means women get the rights. So if I believe in human rights, then all you need to be is human to get the rights. And if the individual believes in human rights, then we simply need to use science to show that the preborn child at the moment of fertilization, throughout pregnancy and just after birth, is as human as you or me, and therefore, if we believe in human rights, that we're all equal, and that by virtue of being human, we have the inalienable right to life, then that applies as much to those who are not yet born as it applies to those of us who are born. I think the other thing is important for us to do is use the language of discrimination, which the culture overall would be opposed to. Don't discriminate based on sex, don't discriminate based on, ability or whatever the case may be. And so I would make the point that abortion is really age discrimination, that any reason we would use to deprive the preborn child or a newborn infant of her right to life is ultimately grounded in factors related to the child's age. So the child is smaller, the child is less developed physically and mentally, the child is very dependent on someone for survival, ultimately because of how old the child is. So the question to ask the culture is, do those of us who are older have a right to kill those who are younger? And I think people would say, no, that's wrong, that would be age discrimination. And then we simply show how abortion falls under that category.
Mm-hmm. And I know that you've got a particular style as well when you're chatting to people. How, if we had asked that question, when you talked about human rights, what makes us human, how would you make someone, take them on a journey, to realise the unborn child is human in the womb? Right.
So I always like to ask the question, well, is the pregnant woman human? Is her partner human? If yes, then it logically follows that their offspring must be of the same species, must be human as well. Two human parents, they're not going to produce a cat, they're not going to produce a cow, they're only going to produce a human. they're only going to produce another human. And so the preborn child, albeit smaller, is nonetheless of the same species as the parents. We also know that the preborn child has to be alive because the preborn child is growing. And if something is growing, that thing would be alive. So by virtue of the fact that even at fertilization, the 1-cell embryo divides into 2 cells and 4 and 8 and so forth, that growth is indicative of being alive, which therefore means the entity is an individual who should be protected. Not only because the child is alive, because lots of things are alive that, I would not protect a spider, for example, that is living and is in my living room. So it's being alive is necessary but not sufficient. That other question to be asked is, what are the parents? And so as long as we establish the parents are human and that the preborn child is growing, then it's a living human and should be protected.
Do I have a right as a man to talk about abortion?
Yes, because it's an issue of human rights, not women's rights. And I think it's important to really emphasize that point, that you don't need to experience something to take a position on it. I am against slavery, even though I've never been a slave. And as a result of that, I therefore don't know what it's like to be enslaved or what it's like to be a slave owner. But I can make a moral analysis of a particular issue without having direct experience. And so, yes, a man will never be pregnant, and yet, if the preborn child is a human being, then a man, just like a woman, has a responsibility to care for those who are most vulnerable in our midst.
Mm-hmm.
And Stephanie, you're an author as well, so you've written a book. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So I've written a book by the same name of my ministry. It's called Love Unleashes Life, and the subtitle is Abortion and the Art of Communicating Truth. And it really is to equip people to be able to respond to the many objections we will hear from abortion supporters, and not only respond to people intellectually, but to reach not only the mind but as well as the heart, realizing that a lot of the objections we hear come from people who have experienced abortion or whose loved ones have experienced abortion, and that direct connection may cause them to put up a wall and not be open necessarily initially to the pro-life perspective. And so it really trains people to know how to encounter and interact with those individuals more on an emotional level if that becomes the issue, rather than only on an intellectual level, which people are also equipped for. And then I talk about basic tactics that are helpful when dialoguing with people, using the approach of storytelling and question asking. And so the more pro-lifers do that in conversation, ask good questions, tell good stories, the more fruitful, in my experience, the encounter becomes.
Yeah, we're trying to do that with Project Truth as well, the young people out in the street, trying to get them to have conversations with people using those kind of stories and questions and actually listening to the person, because that's really, really important. Mm-hmm. And the conversation might have to change depending on what that person says to you, what kind of experience they've had. You have no idea when you're first speaking to them. If you get any sort of tips on how we would have conversations with people, say if someone comes up and says, I've had an abortion, like what would be the tip there of how to speak to that person?
If that person was so upfront as to reveal that they've had an abortion, then I would definitely say, I'm sorry for any difficulty you've gone through. How are you doing? And that's a very open-ended question. Now they might say, I'm totally fine. I think abortion was a good thing. Then I would ask, more open-ended questions to say, well, do you know anyone else who's had an abortion? Do you believe some women may have had a negative experience even though you've had a positive experience? Have you ever encountered those women? Why were their experiences negative? What do you think makes your experience positive?
One of the interesting things about yourself is that there's an argument against the pro-life movement that it's just simply pro-birth, but your arguments encompass the whole life circle, and you focus as well on assisted suicide and the end of life. So maybe we could talk a bit about the problems just now we're having in parliaments across the world who are trying to introduce this legislation. Scotland, I believe, have knocked it back twice. I think they've knocked it back substantially, but it's coming back again pretty soon, we think, for the third time. And each time we're seeing more and more MPs falling back into the sort of line of maybe we could support euthanasia or assisted suicide. So maybe explain from your point of view Why you think we should fight against this, and what's the great danger in assisted suicide?
Well, assisted suicide, like abortion, targets the most vulnerable. When you are in pain, when you're suffering, when you're sick, you're incredibly vulnerable because you're going to be experiencing emotions that your pain will be driving you towards. Maybe making comments like, I want to die, when you don't really want to die, but you do want to be out of pain. And so you're in such deep pain that you will make extreme claims like, I want to die. And rather than the culture responding by killing the individual, if we really cared, if we were concerned about the underlying reason for their request for death, we would dig deeper rather than dole out assisted suicide and find out, okay, what's the problem? Is it physical pain? Let's do better pain management. Is it emotional pain that's manifesting physically, which is sometimes the case? Okay, well then let's identify what is at the root of that. You know, is it a fractured relationship, a broken past, whatever the case, and provide adequate counseling that would help the person work through, you know, some trauma that's being triggered by the experience of suffering that they're having. I think when this topic is raised, what I often do is point people to the insights of psychiatrist Dr. Viktor Frankl, who was also an author and a survivor of the Holocaust. And in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, he provides a lot of profound insight for how people can respond to suffering and alleviate the suffering without actually eliminating the sufferer. And that really is what's at the core of the pro-life message. Let's alleviate suffering without eliminating the sufferer.
I mean, someone would fire back to you simply in emotive terms that they wouldn't treat, for example, their dog in the same way that they would treat they see their grandparent or their parent suffering, they've got a terminal illness, they're going to die, maybe, they're definitely going to die in 6 weeks' time. And they say, well, let's just hasten death now. What would you say to those people?
You know, when people bring up that analogy, we don't treat dogs this way. Well, humans aren't dogs. I mean, we don't put food for grandma on the floor and expect her to eat out of a dish, which we do for the family pet. You know, so we don't treat grandma the way we would treat a dog at the end of his life because grandma isn't a dog. Now, if we were to probe deeper though and think, well, why would someone make that analogy? It's because they are thinking, but we don't want the dog to suffer. And so it's understandable that we wouldn't want grandma to suffer. The pro-life response is not that we're okay with suffering, it's that we aren't okay with a particular response to suffering that involves eliminating the person rather than the pain or the underlying issue. And so that's where Dr. Frankl's insights are very important. He came up with a mathematical equation that he phrased as D equals S minus M. And by that he meant despair is suffering without meaning. And so his point simply was that S, or suffering, is a part of the human experience. The reality is all of us have suffered and all of us will suffer. So as long as we're alive, we're going to experience suffering. If we kill grandma because she's suffering and close to death, why not kill a teenager who's suffering and may or may not be close to death? But if suffering becomes the issue for ending, the reason for ending someone's life, then it doesn't just end with grandma, it begins with grandma. So Frankl's point is that in the face of suffering, whether we despair or not, which is what would lead to the suicide or the assisted suicide, whether we despair or not is entirely dependent on the M. Can we find meaning in our suffering? If we don't find meaning in our suffering, if the number for meaning, let's say for the sake of this equation, was very low, no meaning, then the number for despair is going to go very high. But if we can find profound meaning in our suffering, that number being a very high number, then the number for despair would be very low. We wouldn't despair. And so Frankl's whole philosophy was built around helping people find meaning in their suffering. And he gives an example of a teenager in Texas who was in a car accident. She became a quadriplegic, couldn't move her limbs, and he said, let me tell you how she spends her days. Watching the news, listening to the news, reading the news. Whenever she would come across a story of someone who was suffering or going through some hardship, she would ask for an assistant to come to her, to then place a stick in her mouth, which she then used to pound out letters on a keyboard in order to write notes of encouragement to people she read about in the news. And he said that young woman lives a life of profound meaning. Now, was she suffering? Of course. But was she despairing? No, because she found meaning. And so I think that's what we need to do for grandma or anyone else who's in a situation where they perhaps are closer to death than you or me. How do we help them find meaning? And that's what palliative care or hospice is all about. Building connections, being in the present moment, holding someone's hand, listening to beautiful music with them. There's a physician back in Canada by the name of Dr. Harvey Chachanov who has developed a program called Dignity Therapy, which is to help those who are sick and dying tell their stories, their last messages. What do they want to leave behind as their legacy? So that's what we can do with Grandma, who's feeling, I have no purpose, what's my point? Grandma, tell me your life lessons, and I want to write these down. And I want to share this with people beyond your presence when you do pass, and that's how your message will live on. Now, Grandma's going to feel purposeful, even though she's not going to live much longer.
Mm-hmm. And you said you were here as well for the SPUC Youth Conference, so you're speaking on abortion there. So yes. Do you want to give us just a couple of insights into your talk?
Sure. So with the youth, really, it will be about equipping them to be able to speak to their peers on the topic of abortion. So I will be emphasizing the human rights argument that I went through and really helping them be able to make the case scientifically as well as philosophically. So as pro-lifers, we need to be able to prove scientifically, objectively, that life begins at fertilization. But then we need to be equipped to wade into the more philosophical argument abortion supporters will bring up, where they distinguish a human from a person and will argue that even if biologically that one-celled embryo is alive and of the species Homo sapiens, the embryo doesn't have to be protected because the embryo is not a person. And so how do we make the argument that philosophically or legally speaking, personhood should be applied to preborn children who are human the way it is to you and me? And so I'll be fleshing that out in more detail.
Yeah.
Looking forward to it.
Another thing I was interested to go back to assisted suicide. There's a lot of fudging of terms. So in this country we've got euthanasia, we've got assisted suicide, we've got assisted dying.
Yes.
What is that all about?
Well, okay, just again, like abortion, there's so many parallels. Language is powerful. And the other side, those who are proponents of a culture of death, realize that if we talk about the act in negative terms, people will feel negative towards it or repulsion. But if we want people to be attracted to it, well, let's use language that's more sanitized. So in my country of Canada, where assisted suicide has just become legal in the last couple of years, they call it MAID, the acronym for Medical Assistance in Dying. Well, I mean, that sounds so positive, and so that's why, and then euthanasia, while an accurate term, is not really, a lot of people don't know what that means. So again, the vagueness of the term does not convey really the brutality of it, the targeting of the vulnerable. But if you were to just talk about suicide, people instinctively think, oh gosh, that's terrible. You know, when we hear of famous people that have committed suicide, it's always a front page tragic news story. When we hear of peers tempted to commit suicide, we're always told, hey, get them help. That's one secret you don't keep to yourself. There's these suicide hotlines that people will provide. And so because there's a negative perception of suicide, I believe that's one of the more powerful terms as pro-lifers we need to use when speaking about what's going on. To be accurate though, we just throw the word assisted in front of it. But then we make the point, as my friend and he's an author, Jonathan Van Maren, a former colleague of mine, as he has pointed out in his book on this topic of assisted suicide, he asks the question that we're to ask the culture. Who gets suicide assistance and who gets suicide prevention? And if you think about that, you know, a lot of people will say assisted suicide is all about choice. If you want it, you should be allowed it. But the reality is the person who's just seeking suicide would claim that they want it. And yet, if I were to discover a friend who's depressed and wants suicide, and the hospital I take my friend to would immediately step in and offer suicide prevention, then it's not really about choice. It's about judgment. The hospital would be judging that individual is a life worth saving. But if I have another friend who's not, you know, a peer who's depressed, but maybe a grandma who is near death, and says she wants suicide, and I bring her to the hospital, and then she's put through a whole series of questions that would lead her down the path to assisted suicide, then we're making the judgment, let's say the institution, that she's not a life worth saving. So people say it's about choice, but if they're automatically not following through on one person's choice and they are on another, you get suicide prevention, you get suicide assistance, then it's about us, me, society, the institution, making a judgment. That's a life worth saving, but that's not. And who are we to make that judgment on another's life? If we're all equal, then everyone should get suicide prevention.
That's what's fascinating me about yourself, is that you're covering the entire range of the pro-life cause. You're diminishing that whole idea that you're just pro-birth. and you're not, so you're actually encompassing the whole lifespan of a person and beyond as well, in some sense. So you're going to the Spark Youth Conference. It's going to be fantastic, and unfortunately I can't be there, but Louise will be there, and we're looking forward to hearing all the stories about the trip. How many are going?
So the conference, probably, it's actually fully booked. They had to stop taking bookings, so I think the conference centre can only hold about 180 of us, so we had to put a cap on it there. So yeah, there's a full bus going from Scotland, so we're pretty good.
And that's your first time back in Scotland, or you're...
I was back a year and a half ago, and then before that visiting family. About every 10 years of my childhood we came here. So.
Try to get back here as often.
Yeah, now that I was back a year and a half ago, we're upping the ante here. Yeah. Used to be every 10 years, now it seems every 2.
We're going to do a wee tour of up north next week and let her see around there. So we're going to Loch Ness actually, and that's a significant story for you.
Yeah, so I'm super excited to be going to Loch Ness. I've not been there before, and the reason why I'm so excited is because one of the points that I make in my talks on abortion is that the preborn child begins her life or his life in an instant, the moment of fertilization, but does need time to develop. And so an analogy I'll often use to emphasize that point is to ask my audience to think about a Polaroid camera. And if we think about how those cameras work, you put your cards in the camera, snap a photo, and when one card initially comes out, you don't see on the paper exactly what you'd seen in front of you. You see those black marks. You wait a few moments, shake it, and then you'll see the form on the paper, what you'd seen in front of you. And so I always say to my audience, imagine you're traveling to Scotland, and imagine you're on a boat tour of Loch Ness, and imagine you're taking photos with a Polaroid camera. And imagine, as you're doing this, Nessie appears. And so you take a photo with the Polaroid, and Nessie goes underwater as the card comes out. Well, you won't be disappointed she's disappeared because you now have the evidence in your hand, which you know is not for your photo album, but is a source of income because you're going to sell it. You're going to sell it to newspapers and magazines. You can prove Nessie's actually real. And so you begin shaking the little card, I'll tell my audience, and let's imagine, I'll say, that someone on the boat tour who's never seen a Polaroid before doesn't know how the technology works, so they excitedly grab the card to look at Nessie. But when they look at the card, they see those initial black marks. So they think, oh, too bad the photo didn't properly take. So with disappointment, they rip it and toss it in the lake. So I then say to the audience, would you be frustrated they destroyed the photo? And already people react and they say, yes, of course. And then I say, well, imagine if you get angry at the person for destroying the picture. They look at you like you're crazy and say, it was just black marks. Why do you care so much about black marks? And I say, you'd likely reply, it wasn't just black marks. Everything about the image of the Loch Ness Monster was captured in an instant, but it just needed time to develop. And then that's the point about the moment of fertilization. Who the child is, being genetically distinct from the mother and father, is captured in the instant of fertilization, but like the Polaroid picture, needs time to develop. But just as the value of that Polaroid is established the moment the photo was taken, the value of the individual is established the moment of fertilization. So now I'm actually going to Loch Ness, and Louise and I we're going to take a Polaroid camera just in case Nessie appears.
Who was the first person to discover Nessie, or historically record the story of Nessie?
I do not know, but I know that my grandma swears she saw Nessie.
How much Scottish does she have? It was St. Columba who was the first person to have seen Loch Ness Monster and banished the water beast. Yep. So there you go.
I always thought that was St. Andrew.
He did come to Scotland. Well, thank you very much for joining. That was fantastic.
Thanks.
That is very good, and I hope everything goes very well for the rest of your trip.
Thank you.